Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the sixth and last session of Recycled Architecture Virtual Talk Series. Last week's session with Asif Khan was quite inspirational. I'm confident this week's session will be equally valuable. These talks are hosted by the Middle East innovation leader and pioneering force for sustainability, BIA, in collaboration with Khazan Park. BIA's ventures range from waste management and renewable energy to sustainable transportation and environmental consultancy. Their new headquarters is set to launch at the end of this year, is an architectural marvel and by far the office of the future that emulates the company's twin-pillared strategy and sustainability and digitalization. Today, we are delighted to talk to Kaz Yoneda, who is the founding principal and CEO of Bureau 021. Graduated with a B.Arch from Cornell University and an M.Arch from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, Kaz is equally committed to practice, research, and education. Currently, he's a studio critic at Waseda University, lecturer at Keio University, adjunct professor at Hosei and a lecturer at Japan Women's University. Previously, and to state few, he has taught at Harvard's GSD and the design as a design critic in architecture and was appointed to run Harvard's GSD's Tokyo Abroad Studio with Toyo Ito. He has lectured at Cornell University, University of Tokyo, Nihon University, College of Fine Arts, and during 2017-2019, he was a local professor of UCLA XLab program. In 2014, Kaz was shortlisted for the prestigious Wheelwright Prize. In 2018, he was awarded the Richard Rogers Fellowship to research about the London Olympics Legacy Master Plan. The showroom he co-designed while at Takram called Aurora for Toppan Company, received the 2019 Good Design Award. Kaz interviews and written pieces has been published in Japan Architects, Shinkanchiku, GA, Japan, the Architectural Review, Redshift, and Built. He has contributed to or have been featured on Metropolis, Wired, Motherboard, Icon, and Architecture Boston. His works have been exhibited at Documenta 13, Art Institute of Chicago, Sullivan Galleries, and 2121 Design Site. Kaz is a professional member of the Japan Institute of Architects, JIA, a full member of Architectural Institute of Japan, AIJ, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, UK, FRSA. Important notice to our audience, please feel free to ask questions in the comments on BIA's YouTube channel as we are live on it, and I will make sure to read them to our speaker. Welcome, Kaz, to our talks. Now, before we delve into our main questions, please tell us a little bit about your journey thus far and what really inspired you to do what you do.
Hello, thank you for having me here today. Wow, that was a really nice reading of my profile.
Quite impressive, I have to tell you, quite impressive.
Oh no, thank you so much. It's very humbling. Again, my name is Kaz. I'm very honored to be here after an illustrious line of speakers. And it's kind of interesting. I do not come from a lineage of architects or designers. My mother was a topographer and my father was an automobile engineer. And you know, they both passed away when I was 10 years old. So I kind of, you know, explored up until high school, not knowing exactly what my life will be. And I really encountered architecture in high school, and I fell in love with it. And you know, that I think part of it came from my mother before she passed away. For 3 years, she took me all over Japan during summertime. So first year, she took me to all the castles, which I'll show some today. She also took me to temples and shrines, which again, I'll show some today. because I think it's quite relevant to how we can frame the notion of not only recycle, but a different attitude towards practice as a cultural practice. And I think that in a way embedded in my psyche importance of a built environment. And I think, that in a way led to my career as it is today. Again, thank you for reading my introduction. So I don't think I need to speak any more about my background other than that. I think I love this quote by Luis Borges, which talks about, I think he is every person that he's met, every person that he's loved, and every city that he's visited, it is me. So in a way, I am a flaneur, and I also am not rooted in one place. So now I'm in Tokyo, but maybe one day I will be in Dubai.
Oh, inshallah, we say inshallah, hopefully.
Inshallah. Yes, absolutely.
Kaz, what is your philosophy on the role of recycling in architecture, and how do you apply that in your project, or give us your insight about it?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and maybe I'll share my screen if that is
yes,
allowed.
Please do so. Yeah.
So I think the role of recycling in architecture is a very contentious one. And what I believe is we should practice in a way that doesn't really require recycling to begin with. Because recycling presumes that there's some waste in material, or there's a redundancy in the way we practice and execute the projects. So what I try to do in my projects is to, especially this project I'm showing right now in a title page, this is probably going to be the first highly insulated, naturally used material, and very low energy expenditure as a maintenance. And it's made by wood, completely in Japanese, locally produced wood, and cladded in very sustainable material of copper. And the triple glazing makes it very, good for, even if it's glass, triple glazing. Probably, it might not be important in some parts of the world, but in this particular part of Japan, using a triple glazing window could literally mean a border between life and death, because it's really cold or really hot, and you need a high level of insulation. So I think it's really, at least for me, important to frame it as what exactly are you recycling, and how exactly is the life cycle of the material or even the space being imagined, not only for the very short period of the life of the architect, but the long span of the building. And I really like to bring up this example of Ise Shrine. I visited there when they just completed the first, not first. So I must contextualize this, because Ise is rebuilt every 20 years. It's this grand ceremony that has continued for over 1,000 years. And every 20 years, the shrine is rebuilt, but there's always two, one that's old and 20 years old, and one that's brand new. And the old one is dismantled, and the new one stands in a plot next to it. There's always a duality. So I visited when the last 20-year cycle was completed. But an interesting thing about this building is it's ancient in idea. The form and style is thousands of years old, but the material itself is 20 years old, right? Even at the oldest stage, right? So what's happening here is the material actually isn't thrown away. So this, I think, is a really good example of recycle and reuse. So this is a scene of a lesser shrine, and you can see on the left a 20-year-old structure, and then on the right you see a brand new structure that has been made. The beauty about this system, so it's not really recycle as a one-off moment, in a building's life or material's life, you have a 20-year cycle where the material is then, after it's dismantled, it's actually used to make all the other surrounding infrastructure, like the bridge, the torii gate, or smaller shrines in the area. So wood is very interesting material. It can be shaven and reused in this particular form, because a craftsman is treating the wood in a very precious and precise way. So you see on the left, the pile of wood that is being dismantled and being reused in a lesser, because as you shave the wood down, it's going to be smaller and smaller and smaller. So you basically scale down the size of the wooden structure as it passed down. So there's many examples of these Japanese practices that reuse wood in this very, and that's why I don't really want to call it recycle, because the wood is treated from the beginning as if it's meant to last forever, right? So it really profoundly changes the definition of the material life cycle and how it's being used. Another, I think, important fact about this building, and I think as architects or as a researcher, it's always a problem of passing down the knowledge, the craftsmanship. And what's happening every 20 years is the old crafts or master craftsman is going to pass down his or her skill to the next generation. So it's not really a recycle. What is happening is there is a cyclical relationship between not only the building itself, but a generation following that is going to carry on the craft. Because imagine this particular style is being reproduced or recreated every 20 years. Style is the same for thousands of years. So there's a craft, people, and this is actually applies. So, people think only the building is rebuilt every 20 years, but in fact, everything is remade 20 years, down from the mirror inside the shrine, down to they have all the paraphernalia, the gown, the crown, the swords, all actually is recreated every 20 years. So it's not the building or an so it's not just architecture, it's actually the fabric, the silk, the swords, the metalwork, all this is replaced every 20 years. So what that does is it kind of creates the cycle, sustainable cycle of knowledge that's going to be passed down from one generation to the next. So I think I guess the philosophy there is, recycle presumes that it might be either one-off, or the idea that only the material needs to change its state of being. But it's really interesting about this, typology is the knowledge of how do you pass the creation or the design or the production is actually more important or equally important to the structure itself. And I think that's how I would frame. So, the recycle to me, in fact, is really a cyclical, and it's not a loop that comes back. It's always moving forward in time. So it's this double helix that's moving forward in time that is always maintaining certain level of quality and also in this case a spiritual relationship to the culture that's being cited in. So I think for me, I think recycle is a very contentious word, and that's why when I, let's say, think about buildings as such, I want to design something that lasts more than 30 years, which is what Japanese, in Japan, we have a problem of a house that could be demolished every 30 years, not because of any relationship to Ise Shrine, but because the mortgage amortization peaks at 30 years and your house is valueless in 15 years time. So rather than renovating or upkeeping previous house, you might as well demolish and build a new one, which is so counterintuitive to, I think, Western or even Middle Eastern model of a beautiful old ancient structure that not only maintains its value, but increases value over time. And but part of that comes from this mythology or culture that this metabolism is natural, and somehow in that act of creating the next generation, you are also passing down certain level of intelligence, to the next generation. Yeah.
Very interesting. That's very interesting philosophy. Ted, does recycling mean automatically sustainable for you? Can you please give us your input and insight on that? Where does your practice stand with regards to that?
Thank you very much. That's also a very important question. I think recycling is important, and I practice it on a daily basis as an architect, or I'm sorry, as a human. I practice, as you shift your daily waste. But as an architect, I don't think recycling is necessarily sustainable. And I will talk about one example. For example, the Tokyo Olympics, which was supposed to happen this year. So when I was doing the Richard Rogers Fellowship in London, I was looking at the London Master Legacy Plan, whereby they had a wonderful concept of overlay, which is to say, in case of this basketball venue that was designed by Wilkinson Eyre and KSS Design, the overlay strategy meant that the structure after the Olympic Games would actually be dismantled, taken to Rio Olympic for one of their, I think, pre-game tournaments. And the siding of that will be actually next to a elementary or a primary education facility in the favela and the Rio area. So I had this really nice idea that's not just about the 2-week period of Olympics, but rather it would have a life, not in London, but in Rio, and also helping the, let's say, favela population by having this athletic facility in the campus. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but the idea was there. And let's say compare that to Tokyo Olympic. And Tokyo Olympic is also poised to be a sustainable Olympic. And I think 70 to 80% of their structure was supposed to be temporary, recyclable material, basically temporary structures. Problem with that was they did not have an overlay plan like the London Olympics did. So what happened was, so they would make all these pipes and seatings and all the hardware necessary, but there was no plan implemented about, okay, what would happen after the games? So after the apotheosis of 2 weeks, you basically have to store these, and you have to find a people or group of clients that would buy it and then assemble in their, wherever proprietary spaces they have. So the fact that you made it and you have to store it, and then you have to find somebody to care for it and then maintain it. And temporary structures aren't usually made to really last forever, right? So you have this enormous amount of resource and money and human labor going into making something, and yet there's no plan to implement the overlay after the 2-week games. So that, I think, is a really obvious, let's say, example of how recycling or reusing something without plan, without some strategy, is in fact unsustainable and quite detrimental to any economy. So this was another beautiful example of, so this was a volleyball venue for Olympic, London Olympic. And they used the one of the palaces in the Kensington area. And all they did was put up a bleacher around a central court, and they laid a sand from beach, and they turned it into volleyball volleyball venue in the middle of the London city. And it's beautiful, right? It's temporary. You can resell and reuse bleacher very easily, but the scene is quite epitome of London, right? The old and the new, the kitsch and the novel. It had this very beautiful essence of placeness, the idea that you can be sustainable and simultaneously spectacular. And so I think this is a good example of what you mentioned as recycling, being sustainable. And on the opposite side, you have recycling or using materials without plan is actually quite detrimental. So I think without having some sort of a timeline or strategy, any kind of effort to be sustainable or by the method of recycle, always can fall back on being not producing the kind of effect that was intended. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so when one thinks about recycling, the first topic that comes to one's mind is materials. But let's if we keep materials on a side, can you see a way where architecture itself can be recycled?
That's very interesting. So so this was another example of maybe the space itself is reappropriated. And I really like the word reappropriated because that means you don't have to really think about material as such. You can always think about the space, and you can always reprogram the space. I think Zaha's state swimming, I think the swimming arena for London also, they got rid of the wings and it became a very crystalline wall for the the side, and it opened up to the citizens of the East London. This also would have probably been the same thing where wherever it would go, it can be reprogrammed as a athletic facility rather than just a basketball venue. Another maybe example that I like is so this is a castle in Aomori called Hirosaki Castle. Maybe you've been there. It's a beautiful,
yes,
beautiful, yeah. And very famous for its cherry blossom. And so this building was made about 1800s, and it was due for repair. Not the building actually, but the stonework supporting it was actually due for repair. So how do you fix this foundational stonework without damaging the building above it, right? And there's a beautiful technique in Japan called hikiya. And hikiya, basically you lift the entire structure literally by hydraulic jacks, and you move it a couple 100 yards or meters, and then you free the groundwork for renovation. So I went there this June, and this is now being the scene of the stonework being repaired. And
wow,
yeah, so this castle structure is 100 meters away from the stone base, and it's sitting there right now. So it's an interesting relationship between its original placement versus the temporary placement until it can go back after the repair. But I mean, the point is there's a lot of examples of this in Japan because it's timber. So again, I think that comes to kind of a hybrid notion that you can't really, at least from my point of view, you can't really discretize timber or material from the space it creates. And beautiful thing, yeah. So for example, woodwork here is also a good example, right? So you could always change the stone or maybe reconfigure some stone that's damaged, but you can always retain its original form. And so even at the level of wood, this structure after 300 years, it's going to already have a particular form generated by gravity and people, the dynamic forces. And you can always actually in Japanese classical buildings, particularly temples, there's a lot of examples of it being dismantled quite easily because it's not using that much nails. It's a mythology that Japanese architecture do not use nails. In fact, they use quite a bit of nails, but the idea is that you can always plug out the nails and you can always plug back the nails in, like the wedge construction. So a lot of temples in Kyoto, in fact, are parts of the imperial palace structures that when they're building a new palace building, they would give the old structure to the temples or shrines, and they would reappropriate that for, let's say, the main hall or the lecture hall or the area where monks would live. And so I think this idea that, if you can reappropriate spaces, meaning you can move it or you can dismantle and reprogram it and give it to people who really need it, because the original structure and the construction method is very much based, intrinsically with the typology and the form, that those for me are very much inseparable. Yeah. So let's say you dismantle this castle and then you put it somewhere else, you're inevitably going to end up with the same form of this kind of intricate jigsaw puzzle, and you will get a 3-story wooden structure, right? So so maybe to answer your question about how to use a space, is I think yes, it's possible. And for me, it's not unless it's concrete. Concrete is really hard because concrete you can't dismantle and put it back and so forth. But especially if it's a construction method that uses a kind of a discrete elements, it definitely can be disassembled and relocated, reprogrammed, and used in a different place. So this is part of a, I guess, research and work I did while I was at KO in 2016. This was the first year this beach was able to open the beachfront after the major earthquake in 2011, the big Tohoku earthquake. And so they had to clean up the beach and create the wave breakers. So after 5 years of all that civil engineering work, finally people can go back to enjoying the ocean front. And we were asked to design a assemble and disassemblable structure that they can use in perpetuity as long as they maintain it correctly. And the space at that moment, the program was kind of a stage for outdoor, concerts or just sunshade from the blistering heat of Japanese summer, as you can imagine. And so we've taken on this task. This is actually 4 meter wide and 4 meter tall, 8 meter wide, pure arch timber structure using plywood, engineered wood. It doesn't use nails. It uses solely wedges and panels, and basically it's a friction structure. And another challenge was we had to make as minimal variation of discrete pieces as possible, so that the locals, after we hand over the projects, can also assemble this half arch on their own. So this is only made from 5 discrete piece types, and then you just wrap a tent around it for, let's say, rain or sunshade. And you can assemble this in 3 days with 5 people. And I did that with my students. And the interesting thing about this was, first year we made it with the locals and we passed the baton to them. And they had a great ocean day. And we were very happy to see it open. Second year, they made it into a kind of a commercial space and resting area for people who came to enjoy the ocean. I think third year, they turned it into a kind of a shop and the event space. And then, so every year they can reappropriate, change the content of the vessel, as long as the structure is in a way open for interpretation. And so this was in a way our execution of exactly the kind of reappropriation of spaces.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, a lot of materials used in building industry, interior fit outs and urban installations, are of organic natural substance. We can state few: wood, glass, brick, and so forth. So what are the materials that you used in your architecture, and how these materials affect and define your design process and product?
Thank you for that question. I think it's projects are very interesting because you always have a dialogue not only with yourself but with a client, or in some cases an entire community. So it's not just your desire. But yeah, so but we are very lucky to have clients that are very mindful of the environmental impact of their building. So this example of a project in Nagano, which hopefully will break ground actually this month or next month, we're very close. This is the foundation. Unfortunately, we have to use concrete, but other than that, it is a timber structure using locally sourced hinoki, which is a very traditional Japanese wood, same wood that's used for temples and shrines for thousands of years. And the insulation is actually also timber as well, from a timber shaving. So part of it is Pavatex and Pavaflex, and a Japanese wooden fiber insulation. So insulation typically is inorganic. It's very important. I think insulation is one of the most important things that Japanese building industry do not really do a good job of. It's very important. And in this case, we're doing 3 layers of Pavatex, Pavaflex, and wooden fiber. And then, of course, you have the copper cladding and all the timber fittings and so forth. So this project, we are quite mindful of using local timber, and where we can to use engineered wood. So like the practice of Ise Shrine, where you have piles of these used material from previous structure. Beauty of engineered wood, I think, is, let's say, typically an old Japanese building industry practice, if you can't get a solid column out of one piece of wood, it was just kind of disposed or were used as a fuel, basically, to burn. But the introduction of CLT or LVL or ply or any kind of assortment of engineered wood has allowed very structurally sound members to be created. And part of this is also only made out of a structural plywood that's about 18 mil thick. So in this case also, we use hinoki in a visible area. And then in the invisible area, we're using a repurposed Japanese larch engineered wood, for example. So, and then copper, of course, actually copper is a very interesting product because it ages actually quite well. First, it won't be this green. First, it will be that particular copper, orangish metal surface. And then first it'll turn brown and black. And then in 15 or 20 years time, it'll turn this really nice patina, like the Statue of Liberty in New York. So this process of time, I think, is really important. So I think time is another aspect that actually should help architects evaluate if the material is going to age well, basically, yeah. So this is another project we've done in Tokyo, and we've used concrete, which concrete, you could technically say it's sustainable because you can crush it and use it as an aggregate and reuse, so forth. But it's not as seamless like, let's say, steel, which you can melt and reuse, or glass also you can reuse, or timber, you can always have that life cycle of diminishing scales. But in this case, concrete was the main structural element, but the interior, we try to use as much wood as possible and so forth. So yeah, I think that on one hand, you have dialogue with a client to produce the most optimal performance and then material selection. And I want to just bring attention to one statistic, which is Japan, as you know, is decreasing in population since its peak in, I think it was 2015 or so. And yet, Japan is still producing as much new house as America.
Oh.
So this is quite interesting. So
interesting.
even though, yeah, very interesting. So even though we're, decreasing in population, the vacant house is actually increasing, and a new homemaker house to the top left is also increasing. While you have these beautiful 100-year-old houses, I live in one of these 100-year-old houses, but these are being demolished because the owner has kind of let go of the ownership of these kind of structures. Yeah. So I think that's a missed opportunity, and increasingly architects in Japan, and myself included, are doing more of these either renovation or reappropriation projects that actually reuses this old structures in a way that keeps the character, but you have to, in a way, incorporate modern technology and comfort into these, beautiful, beautiful wooden Japanese houses. So I think that trend will increase more as we realize that making these plastic houses with very small insulation and one glass pane windows actually is quite unsustainable. And it's also in the terms of the life expectancy of people living in it. You don't have a high insulation, so you are always exposed to hot or cold air. And you have in Japan, there's such thing as a homesick syndrome, or I'm sorry, sick home syndrome, which is this case of dews and air ventilation not at the optimum level and so forth. So I think these are kind of more ethical practices that you have to be mindful when you're doing projects, particularly in a very snow hit area, or in Okinawa, which is a complete opposite, which is you have these very hot, tropical climate, much like Dubai, and you have to care more about the heat rather than the cold. So Japan actually is very diverse climate. You have a Hokkaido, it's very cold and near Arctic, and you have Okinawa that is quite tropical and humid and moist. So you have this range to deal with. So I think this particularity of context and how you analyze that is as important as what you choose about the material you use. So for example, in Okinawa, you would not use timber actually, because there's a termite problem, and the termites would eat the wood like it's a bird feed, and your building will crumble. So typically in Okinawa, you have to either use concrete or stonework, or let's say steel structures, which could be sustainable and recyclable in its own way. But when it's afforded, I think timber is quite interesting material in its pure form, as much as possible. Yeah.
I actually agree with you. I mean, when it comes to Japan, it's amazing the diversity from north to south, in the weather and the scenery and all of that. And it's amazing how also architects have to think about, the actual space or the actual place and the context in order for them, to construct. So that's actually fantastic.
It's a interesting testing ground. So as you know, because of this trend of house that basically loses its value in 15 years, and every generation is able to build their own, let's say, ideal homes. That's why you see so many young Japanese architects, I guess including myself, that is doing all these experimental projects. But I guess I'm a little bit of a glitch in that system because I'm not purely Japanese, and all my educational and also part of my professional career has been without boundary. And I believe that the most sustainable house is a house that you do not have to build every 30 years or refurbish every 30 years. I mean, that's the, so for example, I think the house that was built thousands of years in Akka, in Middle East is, much more sustainable than building a plastic prefabricated house for, let's say, $300,000, right? So I think that for me, in a way, I'm trying to practice in a way and also being mindful to, kind of convey to my clients that it's actually a better investment even for them to make a good house now. And if they resell, then the value of the project you've designed should actually either maintain or increase the value of the property. And the only way you can do that is to really design it in a way, of course, using correct material and having a HVAC system in place that's meaningful for long term, but also having the mindset of the client that this is in a way a lifetime investment for themselves, but also if they do it right, it becomes a cultural statement and how they want to project their life.
True. Tepkas, can you please state for us one environmental opportunity and one challenge that you had to face while designing or constructing a project?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Sure. Can you state for us one environmental opportunity and one challenge that you had to face while designing or constructing a project?
I think the part of the first one, the answer to the second question, second part of the question, is there's always a challenge. For example, let's say, particularly in the COVID era, I think logistics has become very difficult. But what is, for me, a learning experience from that, meaning it's no longer easy to ship something from Europe to, let's say, fit out part of the house, right? You have to. So what that forces, I think, us in a good way is to think about locally sourcing both the craft, the technique, and the material as much as possible. And you only resort to outsourcing any one of those three pillars when it's only absolutely required. And so this project, for example, we're again, this is in a way rarely positive, let's say, effect of the this whole global issue, is that we were forced to locally source as much material and components as possible. So I take that as a good thing because it helps local economy. And for example, if the local craftsman is now adept at using that particular material because of this project, they can always use it in the other works that they do as well. So it's a knowledge accumulation, not just for us, but also to, I think, all the people involved in the project. Unfortunately, so the challenge for this project was all the triple glaze window with timber frame can only be sourced from Lithuania because there's not a producer of a highly insulated window in Japan that has the same, let's say, German grade of insulation. And so, but I guess the positive effect of that is now the local craftsman really is aware that, okay, one plain glass window is not enough for insulation when you have all this high surface of glass in any residential projects. And now they're forced to deal with new system of building. And so we enjoy this conversation with them about how to make it. But once we get it imported and we receive it, that's where the real work starts, where you have to assemble it on site and find the right, connection or joints and details and so forth. So I think for me, the opportunity and challenge is always a kind of a two faces of the same coin. And on some point you have to flip. For example, this was another challenge for us, which is because we knew the locals were not going to hire a construction company every time they want to put up these arch structures. So we had to make the system simple enough, basically 5 pieces, and naturally integrate that knowledge into how locals would be able to assemble it the preceding years. So the design challenge was to create this, simple arch with minimum profile and with minimal amount of pieces and no nails. And so that, for me, and I think I echo a lot of hopefully good architects, is that constraint is good. And I'm not saying all the constraints is more than welcome, but I think if you can prioritize what is a really important constraint to the project and then turn that into the strength of the design, then you're actually, I think, is capable of creating a beautiful solution to what I guess a product designer would call a wicked problem. So part of this design here was that we minimized the number of wooden panels into 5 by, initially we're doing these formal studies of what if it was a triangle or what if it was oval. But, actually more complex the geometry gets, the more complex and diverse the pieces become. Mm-hmm. So we thought, okay, let's keep it simple. The structural engineer is very good and he's able to solve the simple profile. So we kept the geometry very simple. We kept all the joinery in a way that's basically a hole and wedge, and it's placed intact by friction with no nails, no glue, and so all this kind of constraints built up eventually to the solution, which I think. I think we understood the solution to work well once we were able to pass it on to the locals, and they just made it the next year. That's when something went right, especially you're handing it over. I mean, same thing with house. The moment you hand over any of these houses to a client, that's the moment where you actually have absolutely no control over the product that you've created, although with their use in mind. So I think, again, for me, challenge and opportunity is the same side of two coins. And it's really about how you're able to reframe the constraint as a positive design issue. And that is, I think, where you're able to come up with a novel solution. And hopefully people will recognize that as a good design.
Yeah, Kaz, very well put. I mean, it's turning the crisis into an opportunity. That's actually, that flipping of the coin is very well put. Kaz, I have some questions from the audience. Guys, I have to really apologize if I could not read all questions because we're running out of time, but I will try to squeeze in some questions so for you to answer. So one of the questions is saying, do you feel older architecture is more sustainable than modern techniques? How would you blend old and modern for an optimal level of sustainability? Let's start with the first part. Do you feel older architecture is more sustainable than modern techniques?
Okay, so I think modern technique is not necessarily modernism. So if we're able to separate that, I think for me, again, and maybe this goes back a little bit to my diagram at the very end of today's talk, is I think we like to categorize either stylistic or technology as this kind of discrete parcel that is, let's say, sequential. But I look at technique or technology as an accumulative process, meaning you always learn and it's always progressing in a kind of a teleological way. Meaning, let's say Greek Parthenon actually was based on the timber structure of the previous epoch. And so there's a lot of illogical thing happening when you have a stone column and stone lintel placed between those two columns. But in fact, the constraint of keeping the timber, let's say, typology or construction system by translating into a marble, they've come up with an ingenious idea of actually making the lintel or I think architrave or entablature into a arch-like segments, and placing it on and keystone basically stabilizes the lintel. So I think the point here is I think you have a lot to learn from previous forms and typologies and vernacular, techniques for sure. And technology, again, for me, or let's say modern or contemporary techniques, is really supposed to be an evolution of that based on efficiency or speed. And I think one thing we can't really, as architects, I think we have to be clear about what is the difference between the means and the goal. And for us, I think modern technique is a means to achieve a particular goal. And I don't think we are practicing to do, practicing the technique of the building necessarily. Of course, you can do that as a mode of thinking, like Freotto or Candela or all these great structural architects. But again, I think it's a goal that's really important. And again, it's a tool to accomplish something. And so my answer to that is, I think it's not about superiority over time, and we should learn from our past and learn from vernacular architecture. But if we are able to do it using and enabled by contemporary technology, whether it's BIM or material science, that actually improves the quality of the quality of life or quality of the space, then I think we are at. So these are all tools, and we should choose. Like any good surgeon, you have many tools, and some of the medical tools are ancient. Scissors and knife have existed since thousands of years. And on one hand, you have Da Vinci robot that can accomplish surgery from million miles away. But you can use both to accomplish a very important thing, which is to save lives. So for me, I think you learn from both, and you have to be clear and not conflate what is the tool and what is a goal, and just be able to use it accordingly to your ethos, what you want to accomplish.
Okay, so I'm going to go with one last question, before we head for the closing note, because there's no time. So do you see Japanese sustainable building principles influencing this region more? Can you highlight a project that for you stand out in this region?
In Japan or in Dubai?
In the Middle East.
In the Middle East. Oh, that's a good question. And sorry, my answers are very long, so I apologize.
No, not at all. I mean, you're here, because we want to learn from you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm very humbled by that. That's interesting. I think one of the things that I've noticed, particularly when Kenzo Tange or Kisho Kurokawa or many of the Japanese architects were actually practicing and producing incredible scale works in Middle East. I think one of the elements that helped, in a way, commensurate, let's say, not so much Japanese per se, but how the environmental relationship to Japanese architecture has, let's say, positive effect on the regional, let's say, climate. For example, Japanese architecture traditionally was designed for much more temperate climate, so warmer and a little bit drier. Now it's becoming more cooler and wetter, actually. So we're becoming semi-tropical because of global warming. And so the climate has changed, certainly. But in traditional Japanese architecture, it was about how do you let the wind pass through in a passive ventilation? How do you let the sunlight in without creating a strong, glaze? How do you create this interstitial space between inside and outside that actually works as a mitigation between internal and external temperature? And so I think these kind of vernacular practices, and also how that translated through, let's say, modernistic architects in Japan, like Maekawa, Kunio, and of course, Tange himself, I think it helped in a way frame not so much as a formal practice that could be, let's say, cross-fertilized with Middle East traditions and typology, but in fact, it's kind of complementary to it. And I think those moments that I mentioned, like the wind, how do you have passive ventilation? How do you bring in external elements without completely evading the internal space? And how do you create the interspatial, like the courtyards in traditional, I think, Islamic architecture? Of course, Japan also used to have inner courtyards in very traditional residential complexes, where it really became this very nice cooling effect space, where it mitigated from, you know, the external temperature and to the internal. And of course, you bring in green and scenery into the habitual space as well. So I think there's always resonance, and that might be part of a universal culture of architecture that we can learn from each other, and hopefully can find a complementary relationship with each other's vernacular. There's obviously certain things you can't translate, like using wood might not be most rational in Middle East, but of course there's great examples of, you know, timber screen that's being used in traditional Islamic architecture as well. But you know, Japan has used it for a screen, but also structure. And of course, you know, it's interesting to imagine even the roof in traditional Japanese architecture was wood as well. So Ise Shrine, it's actually using the bark, right, or the hay of the stalks to make this. And of course, over time, you have grass growing or moss growing, and it kind of becomes nature in itself. So of course, that won't be a very nice translation into a different cultural context. So I think it's about right kind of cross-fertilization and what's right for that particular context. And, you know, you learn from each other.
Okay. Excellent. Kaz, I will please ask you to unshare your screen so we can go to the closing notes.
Absolutely.
So, perfect. So, all right, guys, Kaz, any closing thoughts on architecture and recycling? And what do you think our audience should take away from this interesting talk?
Thank you very much. Well, that's a very big challenge, I think, today. The most difficult question today is that. But again, I think I've talked most about it today, which is for me, the best kind of recycling is not to waste at all from the beginning. Okay. So it's about how you practice and how you set up a building in a way that can last, you know, in perpetuity, as long as the people who live in it loves it, maintains it, and can pass it along generation, even if the owner has changed. So I think for me, that's really important. And the second part, I think, is this opportunity and challenge is always for me a part of a two-sided coin. And it's about how do you look at the constraint as not as a negative restriction on creative solution, but in fact, it's something that really helps you come to a novel solution. And I guess, you know, we can always ask for good clients and good institutions to be mindful. And I think that's happening all over the world, which I think clients and institutions are becoming more mindful about not only material practice, but also how do you design. I think the last question particularly was about form and tectonics of architecture, that in itself, you can learn from vernacular, but also contemporary technology. And when I think they combine in a novel way that is about zeitgeist of basically today, I think that's when you really have a really interesting prospect of a truly sustainable. And it's, for me, it's not about LEED. I mean, LEED is important, but it's not about making a checklist. It's really about creating a culture about sustainability or sustainable practice in a way that it becomes secondhand. So I don't really call myself you know, like sustainable architect or sustainable designer, because I think it should become so ingrained and secondhand to the way we think about you know, construction or material or design as such, that for me, I don't want that to be the selling point of my own persona. And so I hope that today kind of demonstrated that what's really important is the goal. You know, what's the aspiration, and what is a kind of a holistic vision we have as architects and designers to accomplish kind of a not utopian in a kind of a la kind of way, but in a very critical way, how we produce, you know, the actual reality of built environment.
Okay, excellent advice. Thank you so much, Kaz. You know, unfortunately, we have to end now. So really thank you for this impressive talk. Thank you all for tuning in to this last session. Bia and Khazan Park, thank you for making this happen. I'm confident that our audience learned many things throughout these insightful talks. A final message: let us keep learning and exploring, as this is the only way for us forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.